Here is something that will absolutely break your brain. In the summer of 1775, a black man named Salem Poor fought with such extraordinary courage at the Battle of Bunker Hill that 14 white colonial officers signed a formal petition to the Continental Congress calling him a brave and gallant soldier worthy of a special reward for his heroism in the field. 14 officers, 14 signatures. Congress received that petition, reviewed it, and then did absolutely nothing with it. Salem Poor returned to the battlefield. He endured the brutal winter at Valley Forge alongside George Washington and the Continental Army, where men were dying of frostbite and starvation every single week. He kept fighting, he kept surviving, and when the war ended and America declared itself the greatest experiment in human freedom the world had ever seen, Salem Poor returned to Massachusetts. He lived out his remaining years in crushing poverty and died in a Boston almshouse. A man called brave and gallant by his own officers died destitute and forgotten. Think about that for a second. This man bled for a revolution built on the idea that all men are created equal. He earned the highest honor his fellow soldiers could offer, and the country he helped bring into existence treated him as if he had never existed. But here is the truly remarkable and disturbing part. Salem Poor was not the exception. He was the rule. Thousands of black men fought in the American Revolutionary War on both sides of the conflict. Some chose the Patriots, some chose the British. Almost every single one of them was promised something they never received: freedom, dignity, recognition, a legitimate place in the nation they helped build. Today we are going to talk about what really happened to those men, and I promise you, it is not the version they taught you in school. Not the polished, sanitized, marble statue version. The real version. The one that is complicated, painful, and utterly impossible to look away from. Because here is what your history textbook almost certainly glossed over or skipped entirely. The American Revolution was not simply a political dispute between colonial elites and the British Parliament. It was, in a very real and very brutal sense, also a war about slavery, about who owned whom, about who qualified as a human being deserving of rights and who did not. Black Americans were not passive bystanders in this conflict. They were active participants. Soldiers, spies, couriers, and strategists. They made deliberate choices under conditions of almost unimaginable pressure. They took sides, risked their lives, and fought with everything they had. The true tragedy is not that they failed. The tragedy is that so many of them succeeded on the battlefield, and it still changed almost nothing about their lives. By the time this video is over, you will never look at the American founding quite the same way again. I genuinely promise you that. To understand what black soldiers experienced during the Revolution, you first have to understand the world they inhabited before the first musket was ever fired. And that world was, to put it as directly as possible, a nightmare. By the early 1770s, approximately 500,000 black people lived in the 13 colonies in a state of chattel slavery. 500,000 human beings, legally classified as property. They could be bought and sold at auction, separated from their spouses and children on a whim, beaten, mutilated, and killed with very little legal consequence for the person doing it. In the southern colonies, especially Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, enslaved people were the foundation of the entire agricultural economy. In Virginia alone, enslaved people represented the single largest category of wealth in the colony, worth more collectively than all the land and buildings and ships combined. Slavery was not a footnote to colonial American life. It was the engine that powered the entire system. And yet, even within this brutal structure, black colonial life was not a single uniform experience. There were gradations, contradictions, and small pockets of something that almost resembled possibility. In the northern colonies, slavery existed but was less economically dominant. Free black communities had taken root in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. These were precarious communities, always under threat, always vulnerable to violence and re-enslavement, but they were communities nonetheless. Free black men in the North could sometimes own property, operate small businesses, and participate in limited forms of civic life. They were not equal, not remotely, but their situation occupied a different position on the spectrum of oppression from their counterparts laboring on southern plantations. It was from within this complicated, stratified, and profoundly unjust world that the first sparks of revolution began to fly. And black Americans were watching every single one of those sparks. The year is 1765. The British Parliament passes the Stamp Act, a tax on virtually every piece of printed material in the colonies. Colonial white elites explode in outrage. They hold meetings, write pamphlets, form committees, and fill the air with passionate speeches about liberty, tyranny, and the sacred rights of Englishmen. And in a tavern in Boston, on a plantation in Virginia, in a free black household in Philadelphia, black Americans are listening to every word. They are hearing the word liberty spoken by men who own other human beings. They are hearing men thunder that no one should be taxed without representation, while those same men buy and sell people who have never been represented in anything, ever. The hypocrisy is staggering. It is almost comically obvious. But here is the remarkable thing. Many black Americans did not simply dismiss this rhetoric and walk away. They picked it up. They held it close. They said, "You claim to believe this, so prove it. Apply it to everyone." And that decision would shape the next decade in ways no one fully anticipated. The first time the name Crispus Attucks appeared in print, it was in a death notice. He was one of 5 men killed on the evening of March 5, 1770, when British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists in Boston. The event became known as the Boston Massacre, and the Patriots turned it into propaganda almost immediately. Paul Revere made an engraving. John Adams wrote about it. Colonial newspapers spread the story across the 13 colonies. Crispus Attucks became a martyr and a symbol, the first casualty of a revolution that had not yet officially begun. What most people do not realize, and what was quietly downplayed even at the time, is that Crispus Attucks was a black man. Probably of mixed African and Wampanoag Native American descent, he was a dock worker, and likely a formerly enslaved person who had escaped from a master in Framingham, Massachusetts. The first person to die for American freedom was a man the system that built America did not even consider fully human. Sit with that for a moment. Attucks was not a passive victim. Every account of that night describes him as one of the most aggressive figures in the crowd. He was tall, broad-shouldered, physically imposing, and he was standing at the very front of the confrontation, shouting, challenging the British soldiers, refusing to back down. When the shooting started, he was the first to fall, hit by 2 musket balls in the chest. John Adams, who later defended the British soldiers in court, described Attucks as the leader of the mob, a characterization he intended as criticism. But read it the other way. The first man to stand at the front of the fight for American liberty was black, was probably formerly enslaved, and was absolutely unafraid. The Patriots used his death when it served them. They held public funerals. They named him a hero. And then, as the revolution moved forward, and the question of what this new nation would actually look like began to take shape, men like Crispus Attucks became uncomfortable to think about too carefully. Better to let the mythology overshadow the man. Meanwhile, the language of liberty was spreading in ways that the white colonial leadership had not entirely planned for. Black Americans in the North, both enslaved and free, were reading the pamphlets and listening to the speeches and drawing their own conclusions. In 1773, a group of enslaved men in Massachusetts submitted a petition to the colonial legislature, arguing that they deserved freedom on the same grounds that the colonists were demanding freedom from Britain. The petition was elegant, devastating in its logic, and completely ignored. In 1774, a man named Caesar Hendricks filed a freedom suit in Massachusetts courts. Others followed. They were using the very legal arguments that white patriots were deploying against the Crown to argue for their own liberation. They were not waiting politely to be included. They were forcing the conversation. And the white leadership of the revolution found this deeply, profoundly inconvenient. Because here is the central tension that defined everything that followed. The men leading the American Revolution genuinely believed in the principles they were articulating, or at least most of them did. Thomas Jefferson, writing that all men are created equal, was not simply cynical propaganda, even though Jefferson owned more than 600 enslaved people over his lifetime. These were ideas that the Enlightenment had been building toward for a century, ideas about natural rights, human dignity, and the limits of governmental power. But applying those ideas consistently and completely would have destroyed the economic foundation of the southern colonies. It would have made a revolution impossible, because the wealthy planters of Virginia and South Carolina would never have joined a movement that threatened their property. And so the founding generation made a choice. They wrote the most beautiful political document in human history and quietly carved slavery into its bones from the very first draft. Thomas Jefferson, in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, actually included a passage condemning King George for the slave trade. He blamed the British for forcing slavery on the colonies. It was absurd, historically dishonest, and conveniently ignored the fact that American colonists had been enthusiastic participants in the slave trade for over a century. But even that weak, self-serving gesture was too much for the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina, who threatened to walk out if it was included. Jefferson removed the passage. The Declaration of Independence, the document that declared all men created equal, was edited to make it more comfortable for slave owners. And everyone moved forward as if this were perfectly normal, as if this were acceptable, as if the contradiction at the heart of the revolution was simply too impolite to mention out loud. Nobody stopped. Nobody quit. The revolution rolled on. But here is what is absolutely wild, and this is the part that almost no one talks about. While the white political leadership was busy papering over this contradiction, the black men who would soon be fighting in the war were paying very close attention to all of it. They saw the gap between the words and the reality. They understood the hypocrisy better than anyone alive, and they were already calculating. If there is going to be a war, which side offers the best chance at freedom? If I pick up a musket and fight, what do I actually get at the end? These were not naive men. They were people who had spent their entire lives navigating a system designed to crush them, and they had become very skilled at reading the room. The choices they were about to make would shock both sides of the conflict, and the story of those choices is one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking chapters in all of American history. It is the spring of 1775. The war has begun. The shots at Lexington and Concord have been fired. The Minutemen have driven the British back to Boston, and the 13 colonies are suddenly, terrifyingly, at war with the most powerful military empire on the planet. George Washington has been named commander of the Continental Army, and he is trying to build a fighting force out of what he charitably described as a mixed multitude of raw and undisciplined troops. And right from the very first weeks of the war, a question emerges that no one in leadership really wants to deal with honestly. What do we do about black soldiers? Because they were already there. They were already fighting. Nobody had formally invited them. They had simply shown up and started shooting at the British. That is the part the textbooks never quite figure out how to explain. The early months of the war were chaotic, in ways that are hard to overstate. The Continental Army in 1775 was not the organized, disciplined force we imagine from paintings and films. It was a collection of local militias, volunteers, and desperately short-term enlistees, who sometimes showed up without shoes or weapons. In this chaos, black men, both free and enslaved, enlisted in significant numbers alongside their white neighbors. Massachusetts, which had the largest free black population in the colonies, had black soldiers integrated into its militias from essentially the first day of the conflict. Peter Salem, an enslaved man who had been freed specifically so he could enlist, fought at Lexington and Concord, and then at Bunker Hill. Barzillai Lou, a free black man who stood 6 feet tall and played the fife beautifully, had already served in the French and Indian War before the Revolution began. He was not waiting for permission. These men were showing up because this was also their fight, and they intended to be part of it. And then, in July of 1775, George Washington arrived in Cambridge to take formal command of the Continental Army, and almost immediately he issued orders that would have consequences no one fully predicted. Washington was a Virginia planter who had owned enslaved people his entire adult life. He was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of black men serving in the army he commanded. He worried about what it meant, about the precedent it set, about how it looked to the southern colonies, whose political support he desperately needed. So Washington ordered that no more black men, free or enslaved, were to be recruited into the Continental Army. Those already serving could remain, but no new black enlistments would be accepted. It seemed like a clean solution to a politically complicated problem. It was, in fact, one of the most consequential miscalculations of the entire war. And within months, Washington would be forced to reverse himself entirely, for reasons that had nothing to do with principle and everything to do with a man named John Murray. John Murray was the 4th Earl of Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, and he was not a man who cared deeply about the rights of black people. He was a pragmatist, a strategist, and a man whose back was pressed hard against the wall. By the fall of 1775, the Patriot movement had effectively driven him off the Virginia mainland. He was governing from a ship in the Chesapeake Bay, his authority a fiction, sustained only by the presence of the Royal Navy. He needed troops. He needed fighters. He needed a way to destabilize the Patriot rebellion from the inside. And on November 7th, 1775, he found his solution. He issued what became known as Lord Dunmore's Proclamation. It declared martial law in Virginia, and then it said something that sent shockwaves through every plantation in the South. Any enslaved person belonging to a Patriot rebel who escaped and reached British lines would be declared free. Read that again slowly. The British Crown, in 1775, officially promised freedom to enslaved Americans who joined the British side. Not to all enslaved people. The proclamation carefully excluded those belonging to loyalists, which tells you everything you need to know about Dunmore's actual motivations. This was not an act of moral conscience. It was a military weapon designed to terrify the Southern planter class by threatening the labor force upon which their entire world depended. But here is the thing about weapons. Once you fire them, you cannot fully control where they land. The proclamation spread through the plantation networks of Virginia and the Carolinas with astonishing speed. Enslaved people who had never read a single word of print somehow knew the details of Dunmore's offer within days of its publication. Networks of communication that the white planter class had no idea existed carried the news from field to field, house to house, plantation to plantation like fire. Within weeks of the proclamation, hundreds of enslaved people had escaped from their masters and made their way to British ships and encampments. By early 1776, Lord Dunmore had organized them into a fighting unit that he called the Ethiopian Regiment. Think about that name for a moment. The Ethiopian Regiment. These men wore uniforms with the words "Liberty to Slaves" embroidered across the chest. Imagine what it felt like to wear that uniform, to have spent your entire life as someone's property, to have been bought and sold and worked and beaten, and then to stand in a military formation with those words over your heart. These were not passive, broken men. They were furious, motivated, and they fought with a ferocity that genuinely terrified the white patriot population of Virginia. The planter class, the same men who had been giving passionate speeches about liberty and freedom, were now facing the literal embodiment of the contradiction they had been desperately trying to avoid. George Washington received reports about the Ethiopian Regiment, about Dunmore's proclamation, about the mass escapes happening across Virginia, and he immediately understood the danger. Not just the military danger, though that was very real. The deeper danger was political and psychological. If the British kept offering freedom to enslaved people, and enslaved people kept taking that offer, the southern colonies would become ungovernable. The plantation economy would collapse. The Patriot Coalition, which depended on the active participation of wealthy Virginia and Carolina planters, would disintegrate. Washington wrote to a colleague in November of 1775 that if Dunmore's scheme was not stopped, it would prove the most dangerous weapon the British possessed. He was right. And so Washington did something he had explicitly refused to do just months earlier. He reversed his policy and reopened Continental Army enlistment to free black men. The decision was not made out of principle. Let us be very clear about that. Washington did not reverse course because he had come to believe in racial equality, or because he recognized the hypocrisy in fighting for liberty while excluding black men from the fight. He reversed course because he needed soldiers, and because he could not allow the British to hold a monopoly on black military service. The calculus was brutally simple. If black men were going to fight in this war, it was better for the Patriot cause that they fight for the Continental Army rather than against it. The moral dimension was, at best, a secondary consideration. But here is where history gets genuinely fascinating. Once that door was cracked open, even a little, black Americans walked through it with purpose, with dignity, and with their own very clear set of goals. And those goals were not always identical to the goals of the white men who were nominally commanding them. So who were these men? Let us talk about some of them, because they deserve to be more than footnotes in someone else's story. We already met Salem Poor, the man whose bravery at Bunker Hill earned him a congressional petition that Congress promptly ignored. But there was also Peter Salem, the formerly enslaved man from Framingham, who fought at both Concord and Bunker Hill. At Bunker Hill, by multiple contemporary accounts, Peter Salem shot and killed Major John Pitcairn, the British officer who was leading the assault on the colonial redoubt when the defensive line finally broke. A formerly enslaved man killed one of the senior British commanders in one of the most significant early battles of the war. Peter Salem survived the entire conflict, was discharged at the end of the war, returned to Massachusetts, built himself a small cabin in Leicester, wove cane for a living, and died in poverty at a poorhouse in Framingham. Same town he had started from. Different man, same brutal ending. There was also Prince Hall, a free black man in Boston who stood at the center of the early revolutionary movement, helped organize black Masons, and petitioned the Massachusetts legislature multiple times for the abolition of slavery during the war years. Tall, dignified, and deeply intelligent, Hall became one of the most consequential black activists of the founding era. There was Cuff Whittemore, a free black man who fought at Concord and Bunker Hill and carried a sword he had taken from a British officer as a personal trophy. There was Primus Black and Cato Tufts and Titus Coburn and dozens of others whose names appear in muster rolls and battle records and almost nowhere else in the historical record. These were real people with real lives, real families, real fears, and real hopes for what this war might mean for them. They are not symbols or footnotes. They were men making calculated, courageous decisions in circumstances that offered almost no good options. Because the truth is that black soldiers fighting on the Patriot side were not fighting for exactly the same thing their white comrades were fighting for. When a white Massachusetts farmer enlisted in the Continental Army, he was fighting to preserve and extend freedoms he already had: his right to property, his right to govern himself, his right to live without British interference. When a black man, free or enslaved, enlisted on the Patriot side, he was fighting for something that did not yet exist for him. He was fighting for a promise, a possibility, a bet on the future. He was wagering his life on the idea that the words in those pamphlets about liberty and equality might someday be applied to him, too. That the revolution might, if it won, eventually be persuaded to include everyone. It was a bet that required enormous faith in people who had given black Americans very little reason for faith. And it was a bet that, for the vast majority of those men, would ultimately not pay off the way they had hoped. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge is one of the most famous episodes in American military history. Washington's army was starving, freezing, dying of disease in miserable huts dug into the Pennsylvania hillsides. Out of the roughly 12,000 soldiers who endured Valley Forge, historians estimate that somewhere between 500 and 1,000 were black men. They suffered the same cold, the same hunger, the same despair as everyone else. They dug the same latrines, carried the same supplies, stood the same freezing guard duty. And when the Prussian drill master, Friedrich von Steuben, arrived in February of 1778 to transform the Continental Army into a genuinely professional fighting force, he trained them all together. Von Steuben had no interest in American racial politics. He simply treated black and white soldiers as soldiers. He trained them side by side, drilled them together, expected the same discipline from all of them. For a brief, cold, hungry winter at Valley Forge, something that looked a little like military equality existed in the Continental Army. It did not last. It never does. As the war extended into the South after 1778, the political dynamics around black military service became far more fraught and complicated. The Southern states were adamantly opposed to arming enslaved people in any form. When Patriot General Henry Laurens, a South Carolinian who had himself traded in enslaved people but had come to oppose the institution, proposed raising an army of black soldiers in South Carolina by promising them freedom in exchange for service, the South Carolina legislature rejected the proposal with fury and open contempt. They said they would rather surrender to the British than arm their slaves. Let that sink in fully. These men preferred British conquest to the idea of their own enslaved laborers holding weapons. The Revolution's stated principles stopped at the property line of the plantation every single time, without exception, without hesitation. And the British kept playing their best card. As the war moved deeper into the South, the promise of freedom for enslaved people who joined the British side continued to draw men and women away from Patriot plantations in staggering numbers. Historians estimate that during the Southern campaigns of 1779 through 1781, somewhere between 25,000 and 100,000 enslaved people fled to British lines, or simply used the chaos of war to escape their enslavers. The British Army in the South was, in a very real sense, a liberation army for the enslaved population of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, even though liberation was a side effect of British military strategy rather than its primary purpose. But the black men and women who escaped to British lines understood this perfectly. They were not naive about British motives. They just made a calculation that British freedom, however impure its origins, was better than Patriot slavery. And can you really blame them for that? Among the enslaved people who escaped to the British was a man named Boston King, who would go on to leave one of the most remarkable autobiographical accounts of the entire Revolutionary era. King escaped from a plantation near Charleston, South Carolina, made his way to British lines, worked as a servant and carpenter for British officers, and was eventually evacuated with the British forces at the end of the war. He spent years in Nova Scotia, endured tremendous hardship, eventually made his way to Sierra Leone as part of the Black Loyalist resettlement, and late in his life wrote a memoir that described his experiences with extraordinary clarity and emotional power. He is not famous. Almost no one outside of specialist scholarship knows his name. But his story, and the stories of thousands of people like him, are as essential to understanding the American Revolution as anything written by Jefferson or Madison or Hamilton. Then there was Harry Washington, and this name should stop you completely cold. Harry Washington was an enslaved man who had been the property of George Washington himself. He escaped from Mount Vernon in 1776, made his way to British lines, and eventually served in the Black Pioneers, a British unit that did logistical work supporting the army. He was, in the most literal possible sense, a man who chose British freedom over patriot slavery. George Washington's own enslaved laborer chose the other side. Think about what that tells you about what Valley Forge and the rhetoric of liberty actually meant to the men who were supposedly fighting for the same ideals as their master. Harry Washington eventually ended up in Nova Scotia and then Sierra Leone, where he would spend his remaining years. The man who had owned him became the first president of the United States. Let that particular symmetry sit with you for as long as it takes. By 1780, the war had been grinding on for 5 years, and both sides were exhausted in ways that go beyond simple military fatigue. The British had shifted their strategic focus to the south, hoping to exploit loyalist sentiment in Georgia and the Carolinas. The Continental Army was struggling with chronic shortages of men, money, and supplies. In this pressure cooker environment, the role of black soldiers and black labor on both sides became more critical and more exploited than ever before. Entire units of black men were doing the hardest and most dangerous work of the war on both sides, building fortifications, hauling artillery, serving as guides through unfamiliar terrain, carrying messages through enemy lines under fire. Their contributions were essential. Their recognition was minimal. Their compensation was almost non-existent. But they kept working. They kept fighting. Because what was the alternative? One of the most overlooked aspects of black military service in the Revolution is the phenomenon of substitution. In many states, white men who were drafted into the Continental Army could legally pay someone else to serve in their place, and in significant numbers, they paid free black men or arranged for enslaved men to serve as their substitutes. This created a situation that is surreal to contemplate. Enslaved men fighting for American independence in the place of white men who would return to enslaving them if the revolution succeeded. The irony would almost be funny if the stakes were not so brutally high. Some enslaved men were promised freedom by their masters in exchange for serving as substitutes. Some of those promises were kept. A great many were not. A man could serve a 3-year enlistment in the Continental Army, survive the war, return to his master, and find himself re-enslaved, despite everything he had been promised. It happened. It happened repeatedly, and the courts in southern states provided essentially no recourse. The name James Armistead Lafayette deserves far more recognition than it currently gets, and I want you to remember it after this video is done. He was an enslaved man from Virginia, whose master, William Armistead, gave permission for him to serve the Continental Army. James Armistead was assigned to work under the Marquis de Lafayette, the young French nobleman who had become one of Washington's most trusted generals. Lafayette was 23 years old at the time, idealistic, genuinely committed to the principles of the Revolution, and James Armistead did something remarkable. He offered to work as a spy. He walked into the British camp at Yorktown and presented himself as an escaped slave willing to work for the British cause. The British believed him completely. He served as a guide, a laborer, a trusted presence in their camps, listening, watching, remembering every detail. And the entire time, he was feeding precise intelligence back to Lafayette about British troop movements, supply lines, and fortification plans. The intelligence James Armistead gathered played a direct and documented role in the planning of the siege of Yorktown, the battle that effectively ended the Revolutionary War. And when the war ended, James Armistead Lafayette returned to slavery. Let that sentence land fully. The man who spied for the winning side, who provided intelligence that helped win the decisive battle, who had served alongside the Marquis de Lafayette and earned the French general's personal admiration, returned to being someone's property. It was not until 1786, 5 years after Yorktown, that the Virginia legislature passed a specific act granting James Armistead his freedom. His petition had cited his wartime service explicitly. The legislature debated it. They took their time about it, and then they freed him. He took the name Lafayette in honor of his commander, which tells you something about the complex mix of gratitude and grief he must have carried. He lived as a free man in Virginia for decades, eventually receiving a modest pension. He died in 1830, 50 years after the battle his courage helped win. The Battle of Yorktown, in October of 1781, was the military climax of the Revolution. Cornwallis surrendered. The British cause in America was effectively finished. And among the soldiers standing in the Patriot lines at Yorktown were hundreds of black men. Some of them had been fighting for 6 or 7 years by that point. They had marched from New England to Virginia. They had survived Valley Forge and the disastrous early campaigns in the South. They had endured the humiliations and the broken promises and the constant reminder that the freedom they were fighting for was not primarily intended for them. And on October 19, 1781, they watched Cornwallis surrender his sword, and they must have felt something extraordinary. Relief, pride, hope. Because surely, after all of this, after everything they had given and lost and survived, the new nation would remember what they had done. Surely the ledger would be settled. It would not be settled. The mythology of the Revolution would be written by white men for white audiences over the following decades, and the black soldiers who had fought and bled and died in that conflict would be quietly moved to the margins of the story, and then off the page entirely. Valley Forge would become Washington's story. Bunker Hill would become Israel Putnam's story. Yorktown would become Lafayette's and Washington's story. The hundreds of black men present at every one of these events would become invisible, not because they had not been there in full force, but because acknowledging them too prominently raised questions that the new nation was not yet prepared to answer with any honesty. It was easier to build the myth of the Revolution as a white achievement. It was easier, and it was a lie. The story of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment stands as one of the most remarkable and most overlooked chapters in the entire war. In February of 1778, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a law allowing enslaved men to enlist in the Continental Army in exchange for freedom, with masters compensated by the state. The result was the formation of essentially an all-black infantry regiment with white officers, but black enlisted men drawn largely from the enslaved population of Rhode Island. At the Battle of Rhode Island, in August of 1778, the regiment held its position against 3 separate charges by Hessian mercenaries, soldiers who were considered among the finest in the world. 3 assaults, 3 repulsions. Military historians who have studied that battle consistently praise the regiment's discipline and ferocity. The men of the 1st Rhode Island had earned their freedom with their courage. And what did Rhode Island do after the war? It did not pass any general emancipation law. Slavery remained legal in Rhode Island until 1842. Freedom for some was not freedom for all. The career of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment also illustrates one of the cruelest ironies of the entire story. After performing with distinction at the Battle of Rhode Island, the regiment continued to serve through the remaining years of the conflict. In May of 1781, a detachment was ambushed near Croton River in New York by Loyalist raiders. The ambush was devastating. Soldiers were killed, wounded, and captured. But some of the captured black soldiers were not treated as prisoners of war. They were sent south and sold back into slavery. These were men who had been legally freed by the state of Rhode Island, who were serving in the Continental Army of the United States of America, and they were sold into slavery by Americans. Because even in the middle of a war for freedom, the market value of a black body was too tempting for some people to resist. This is the history we do not discuss in school. This is what actually happened. Here is a number you need to hear: 89. That is how many black men are currently believed by historians to have fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill. 89 documented black soldiers in a single battle in 1775, before the Continental Army had even formally organized. We know some of their names: Peter Salem, Salem Poor, Cuff Whittemore, Caesar Dickerson, Titus Coburn, Alexander Ames, Barzillai Lou. We know a little about each of them. Most of the 89 are names on a muster roll, or they are not even that. They are gaps in the archive, absences where history should be. The historian Benjamin Quarles, in his landmark 1961 study titled The Negro in the American Revolution, estimated that somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 black men served on the Patriot side during the war. More recent historians suggest the number may have been considerably higher. These men served in integrated units and in all-black units, as infantrymen and artillerymen and cavalrymen and sailors, and in every major theater of the conflict, from the siege of Boston to the final battle at Yorktown. One of the most remarkable and least known stories belongs to a man named Agrippa Hull. He was a free black man from Northampton, Massachusetts, who enlisted in the Continental Army at age 18 in 1777 and served for 6 years, among the longest service records of any soldier in the entire war. He served as an orderly to the Polish general Tadeusz Kościuszko, one of the most interesting figures in the revolutionary story, a man who believed deeply in the founding principles and who explicitly included black liberation in his vision of what those principles required. Kościuszko and Hull formed a genuine and close friendship across the enormous gulf of their backgrounds. When Kościuszko eventually returned to Europe, he left a will directing his American property to be used to purchase the freedom of enslaved Americans. The executor of that will was Thomas Jefferson, who found a series of legal and procedural reasons not to carry it out. A Polish nobleman wanted to free enslaved Americans. Jefferson held the money in trust. The money was never used for its intended purpose. Agrippa Hull lived to the age of 90, outliving almost everyone he had ever known, spending his long retirement telling stories about the revolution to anyone who would listen. Now we arrive at the part of the story where the contradictions become impossible to contain any further. The war is winding down. The Treaty of Paris is being negotiated. The new United States of America, fresh from its victory over the most powerful empire in the world, is about to make itself into a permanent nation. What kind of nation will it be? What will it offer to the people, black and white, free and enslaved, who sacrificed to make it possible? These were the questions hanging in the air in the early 1780s, and the answers the new nation gave to those questions would define American life for the next 2 centuries and beyond. The moment of reckoning had arrived, the promissory note was coming due, and the founding generation was already looking for reasons not to pay it. Let us talk about what actually happened to black veterans who had fought on the Patriot side. The experience varied sharply by geography, and that variation tells you almost everything you need to know. In Massachusetts, the Revolutionary period produced real change. The state constitution of 1780 included language about the natural equality of all men, and the judicial rulings that enforced that language were genuine victories. Freedom suits brought by enslaved people in Massachusetts courts were won. Slavery was effectively abolished in the state. Prince Hall, the Boston revolutionary and veteran who had spent the war years simultaneously fighting and petitioning, lived to see real, if incomplete, progress. He founded the African Grand Lodge of Freemasons in 1787, creating a powerful institutional network in free black communities across the North. He petitioned for black schools in Boston. He was rejected. He petitioned again. He built regardless. He represents a model of persistent, intelligent dignity that is easy to overlook when you are focused on battles and generals. But Massachusetts was not the nation. And the nation being constructed in Philadelphia in 1787 was moving in a very different direction. The Constitutional Convention produced a document that was a masterwork of legal and political architecture. It also embedded slavery more deeply into the structure of American government than it had ever been before. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, while giving those same people exactly 0 rights. The slave trade was constitutionally protected until 1808. The Fugitive Slave Clause required free states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners across state lines. None of these provisions were accidents or oversights. They were deliberate political bargains, without which the Southern states would not have joined the Union. The men who wrote the Constitution knew precisely what they were doing. They were constructing a framework that could survive the contradiction between the founding principles and the founding reality. They chose union over justice. And the black soldiers, who had helped make that union possible, paid the price for that choice with their lives and their descendants' lives. Thomas Jefferson deserves a moment of dedicated attention here, because he is the central paradox of the entire revolution, the man who wrote the most beautiful words about human equality and spent his life surrounded by enslaved people who were doing the actual work of making his comfort possible. Jefferson owned 607 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. He freed 2 of them while he was alive. He freed 5 more in his will. He knew that slavery was wrong. He wrote extensively about his own discomfort with the institution. He called it a wolf by the ears, meaning you could neither hold on nor let go without catastrophe. He was morally sophisticated enough to understand precisely the contradiction he was living in, and he chose comfort over conscience every single time, without exception. 607 people, he freed 7. The man who wrote that all men are created equal died owning more than 200 human beings, and his estate, deep in debt, sold the majority of them at auction after his death. Families separated. People who had served Jefferson and his family for decades sold away from each other and from the only home they had ever known. That is the man on the $2 bill. Now we arrive at the moment I've been building toward this entire video. The insight that reframes everything you have just heard. And here it is. The American Revolution was not one revolution. It was 2. There was the revolution that white America fought, the one that created the United States, established Republican self-government, and declared that political authority must rest on the consent of the governed. That revolution succeeded brilliantly. It produced a remarkable nation that, whatever its failures, represented a genuine and extraordinary advance in human political organization. That revolution is in every textbook. We celebrate it every 4th of July. We put its architects on our currency and carve their names into monuments. That revolution is not in dispute. But there was a second revolution happening simultaneously. A revolution being fought by black Americans, enslaved and free, who heard the same words about liberty and equality and took them seriously in the most radical and literal way possible. That second revolution aimed not just at political independence from Britain, but at genuine human freedom and racial equality within America itself. That second revolution had its own heroes, Salem Poor and Peter Salem, and Crispus Attucks, and James Armistead, and Agrippa Hull, and Boston King, and Harry Washington, and the soldiers of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and the 3,000 black loyalists listed in the Book of Negroes. That second revolution was fought with equal courage and at equal cost. And it failed. Not because the people fighting it were not brave enough, or determined enough, or morally right. It failed because the people running the first revolution made a deliberate choice to let it fail. They chose the political possibility of a united nation over the moral requirement of an equal one. And that choice would cost America more than anyone in 1787 was willing to admit. The consequences of that choice echoed forward through American history in ways that still shape the present day. The compromise that allowed slavery to survive the Revolution made the Civil War nearly inevitable. The Civil War killed approximately 620,000 Americans, more than all other American wars combined. And even after the Civil War, even after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified, the legacy of those founding compromises continued to deform American society in ways both visible and structural. Jim Crow, the sharecropping system, mass incarceration, persistent economic inequality, all of these things have their roots in the choices made by the founders when they decided that the Second Revolution could wait. They did not think it would take this long. They were wrong. And we are still living in the world those choices created, still navigating the consequences of a decision made before the nation itself was a year old. But here is something important. The black soldiers who fought in the Revolution, on both sides, understood the founding ideals of the United States more clearly than most of the founders themselves did. They understood what all men are created equal actually required, if you took it seriously. They understood that liberty was not divisible, that you could not have genuine freedom for some without eventually being forced to reckon with the enslavement of others. They saw the contradiction clearly because they were living it in their own bodies, in their own families, in their own daily reality. And the great, tragic, ongoing American story is the story of a nation slowly, painfully, incompletely catching up to the understanding that its most oppressed and most marginalized people held from the very beginning. The black soldiers of the Revolution were not just fighting for their own freedom, they were fighting for the fuller, more honest realization of the American promise. They were right. The country they helped create took almost 2 centuries to begin to acknowledge it. Let me tell you about one more man before we are done. His name was Lemuel Haynes. He was born in 1753, the son of a white mother who abandoned him and a black father he never knew. He was indentured to a white family in Granville, Massachusetts, and educated alongside their own children. He read voraciously. He became deeply religious, deeply intellectual, deeply committed to the revolutionary cause. He served as a Minuteman in 1775. He marched to Fort Ticonderoga, and sometime around 1776, he wrote an essay that applied the logic of the Declaration of Independence directly and explicitly to the question of slavery. The essay, titled Liberty Further Extended, argued with cool and devastating precision that if natural rights were real, then slavery was a direct and irreconcilable violation of those rights and must be abolished immediately. It was one of the first explicitly abolitionist texts ever written in America. Lemuel Haynes, a black Minuteman, was telling the founders that their revolution was incomplete, that the freedom they had declared applied to everyone, or it was meaningless. He did not publish the essay during his lifetime. It sat undiscovered in manuscript form for almost 2 centuries. He was right. They did not listen. The war was over. The Book of Negroes had been compiled. The black loyalists had sailed north to Nova Scotia on British ships, carrying with them their freedom and almost nothing else. Nearly 3,000 of them, recorded by name and description in General Carleton's meticulous register, arrived on the rocky, cold shores of Nova Scotia in the summer of 1783. The British government had promised them land, tools, and supplies to start new lives. What they actually received was dramatically less than what white loyalist refugees received. They were settled in segregated communities, given smaller land grants on thinner, rockier soil, and consistently denied the full rights of British subjects. The white loyalist neighbors who surrounded them were often hostile and sometimes violent. Some black loyalists were kidnapped and sold back into slavery in the United States or the Caribbean. Children disappeared. The freedom they had fought and risked and escaped for was real, but it was a cramped, cold, impoverished, threatened freedom in a land that did not fully wampum. And yet, these communities persisted in ways that deserve far more recognition than history has given them. They built churches and schools. They maintained their families and their dignity under conditions that would have broken many people. They organized politically and challenged the broken promises of the British government with the same persistent determination that had characterized their entire lives. Henry Washington, formerly the property of George Washington, was there. Boston King was there. Thomas Peters, a black loyalist veteran, traveled all the way to London in 1790 to petition the British government directly about the systematic violation of the promises made to black loyalists. He met with officials. He made his case. He helped set in motion the Sierra Leone resettlement project. An enslaved man, turned soldier, turned refugee, turned political petitioner, turned founder of a nation. The story of Thomas Peters is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire Atlantic world of the late 18th century. Almost no one knows it. In 1791, a Sierra Leone company was formed in Britain with the goal of establishing a free black settlement on the West African coast. They went to the Nova Scotian black loyalist communities and offered them a chance to start again in Africa on their own terms, building their own society. Nearly 1,200 black loyalists, roughly 40% of the entire black Nova Scotian population, accepted the offer and sailed to Sierra Leone in January of 1792. Boston King was among them. Harry Washington was among them. They named their settlement Freetown. They were building something of their own for the first time in their lives. The Sierra Leone settlers faced enormous obstacles: disease, hostile relations with some local African peoples, a Sierra Leone company that repeatedly failed to deliver on its commitments, and eventually, a military confrontation with the company that cost the settlers their formal self-governance. But Freetown survived. It grew. It endured. It is today the capital of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and its founding population were black Americans, former slaves and soldiers who participated in the American Revolutionary War and ended up on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, still insisting on the freedom they had been promised, still building, still refusing to be erased. So here we are at the end of this story, which is not really an ending at all. 250 years after the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, more than 240 years after the Constitution was signed into the permanent structure of American law, and we have spent this time together talking about people who were present at the creation of America, who bled for it and died for it, and contributed to it in ways that have been systematically minimized, overlooked, and forgotten, and who received almost nothing in return. What do we do with that? What does it mean? And how do we carry it forward? Here is what I want you to take from this. Every single one of those men and women made a choice. In circumstances designed to leave them with no good options, they found ways to act with agency, with intelligence, and with an extraordinary kind of courage that we do not have a good word for. Salem Poor chose to fight and fought so brilliantly that 14 officers noticed and signed their names to say so. James Armistead walked into an enemy camp alone and spent months in mortal danger feeding intelligence to the people fighting for American independence. Boston King navigated chaos, war, the bitter cold of Nova Scotia, and the diseases of the West African coast, and kept going, and then wrote down his story so that the world would know he had existed. These men were not defeated by history. History was not kind to them, but they were never defeated. That distinction matters enormously. The story of black soldiers in the American Revolution is ultimately a story about the gap between promise and reality, and about what happens when people refuse to accept that gap as permanent or acceptable. The founders made a promise: all men are created equal. They failed comprehensively to keep it. But the failure did not make the promise meaningless. It made it more urgent, more necessary, more real. Every generation of black Americans since the Revolution has had to decide whether to keep fighting for a promise that keeps being deferred, whether to keep insisting that the words mean exactly what they say, and that the nation is obligated to live up to them. And every generation has made that same choice. That is not naivety. That is not weakness. That is something that looks, to me at least, very much like the deepest and most demanding form of patriotism that exists. The real founding generation of America is not only Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Hamilton. It includes Salem Poor and Crispus Attucks and Peter Salem and James Armistead Lafayette and Agrippa Hull and Prince Hall and Boston King and Harry Washington and Lemuel Haynes and the 3,000 men and women in the Book of Negroes and the 89 soldiers at Bunker Hill, whose names we are still slowly recovering from the archives. They were here. They fought. They built something. They endured. They deserve to be remembered not as symbols or supporting characters in someone else's story, but as full human beings whose choices and sacrifices were as essential to the creation of the United States as anything done by the men on the monuments. They deserve that at the very minimum. And the question I want to leave you with is this. 250 years after this revolution was made, do you think the American founding generation understood that they were creating a standard they themselves could never live up to? Do you think they knew, when they wrote those words, that future generations would spend centuries arguing about what all men are created equal actually means, who it includes, and what it demands? Write your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think, because this conversation matters, and it is far from finished. If this video changed how you see the founding of America, even a little, then please subscribe to Cradle of Democracy. We make these videos because we believe that honest history that does not look away from the hard parts, is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding who we are and where we need to go. The story of black soldiers in the Revolution is just one thread in a much larger and more complicated tapestry, and we are just getting started pulling on these threads. Go watch our video on the Constitutional Convention, where we go deep into exactly how the founders engineered the 3/5 Compromise and what it meant for the next 75 years of American life. The story continues. I will see you there.